Hello and welcome back to Highway to Hoover, a production of SEC Extra over at D1Baseball.com. I'm your host, Joe Healy, joined today by Koki Riley of The Advocate. We're going to talk some LSU baseball, always a team that obviously in Baton Rouge a lot of interest, but even within the SEC footprint, I always get asked, what do you think of LSU this year? What's LSU like? So we're going to get a little better answers with Koki here on the show. Before we jump into any of that, I have to let you know that this episode of Highway to Hoover and every episode of Highway to Hoover this season is brought to you by Academy Sports and Outdoors. Get ready for a new season of fishing fun with Academy Sports and Outdoors and reel in the best gear at low prices every day. Plus, Academy offers easy ways to shop and save time, like free 1 hour in-store or curbside pickup on academy.com orders. Koki, first off, appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks for having me on.
Just let's start super broad. Give us just kind of the summation of what you've seen from LSU so far this season through 3 weeks and change.
I'd say mostly good, and I'd say mostly up to par with what you'd expect from a team that started off the year as what the number 2 or number 3 team in the country, depending on who you ask. And right now they're the number 1 team in the country, and I think a lot of Tennessee fans aren't very happy with that, and I understand that because if you just like watch the games and only watch the games and didn't put any of the preseason stuff into consideration, then it's hard to argue that they haven't been the best team. And like even that game on Wednesday where it was not Wednesday, on Tuesday, where they were tied 5-5, tied 9-9 with Radford in the 5th inning, and they ended up winning 22-9 anyway, and an 11-run inning. Just kind of describes like how much power that team has. But anyway, this isn't a Tennessee podcast. But for LSU, like I think like the biggest difference is I think like the best way to describe the season is to talk about last season a little bit, and given how rocky it was for honestly most of the year. And I think the biggest difference I've seen, at least, between this year's team and last year's team is the offense. They're just taking more quality at bats more consistently. They're not really striking out that much. They're consistently putting the ball in play, and they're walking a ton. They're getting back to that 2023 mentality of, hey, a base hit's as valuable as a walk. And they haven't really talked about the walks a whole ton when we've talked to them, but you can just see that in the at bats, and and it's very clear that they understand this team like can really apply and understand the Jay Johnson philosophy of offense better than last year's team could until the very end of last year. So I'd say like that's been the biggest difference. And then on the pitching side, it seems like they haven't at least have enough pitching, and we can sort of get into the details of that.
Real quick before we talk about some of the specific player stuff, how did the Omaha loss go internally? I think maybe it helped. It was game 1 of a doubleheader, so they had another game to play that day. But obviously from the outside, I've been asked a lot, what was that all about? And some of it, I think, is that Omaha's halfway decent. But honestly, it's still a game that LSU should win, and they didn't. So what was kind of the messaging internally about that after that loss happened? How did it go, internally with the team?
Yeah, I mean, Omaha isn't a terrible team, like you said. I thought they were probably better than Purdue Fort Wayne, which is the first team that LSU played. Um, but the problem with that game, and the guys talked about it, and Jay talked about it, is that they were just way too impatient at the plate. I think at one time they flew out or popped out seven straight at bats in that game. They were no hit through 7 2/3 innings. And that sort of cold streak started in the first game, actually, where they only won 4-2. So the last 3 innings of that game, the offense didn't really do anything. I think they had a couple hits. And then they went hitless for 7 2/3 and didn't get that hit until 2 outs in the 8th inning, obviously. And so in that 11 inning stretch, they had 3 hits, 10 strikeouts, and didn't score a run against Omaha. That's just way too long and just really, really poor play offensively. Ever since then, they've been the exact opposite team offensively. So it was more of a blip in the radar than anything else. But it was just a lot of like, I guess, frustrations compounding on themselves to the point where guys were being really aggressive early in the counts. And even though they actually had a bunch of walks in that game, they all came in the first 2 innings, and they just obviously didn't score anybody in those innings. And I think Omaha's starter went like 3 2/3, didn't have any strikeouts and didn't have any walks, which is just like, and had like 6 walks and no runs, which is just unheard of. So it was just an absolutely bizarre sequence. And again, a lot of that I think was mental and just being overly aggressive at the plate, doing the opposite of all the stuff I talked about just a few minutes ago about the things that they're doing well right now. So that's all that was to me, and that was more reminiscent of last year's team, where you get stretches like that. Usually, against better competition, but you definitely get stretches like that. You just haven't really seen that, with the exception of those 11 innings this year.
Yeah, I think bizarre is the right word. I think every team, even the best teams in the country, almost universally have at least one game every season where it's like, well, that's a total outlier. And obviously LSU hopes that's the case with that
Yeah.
season. Whether it's something you've observed or whether something you've heard from Jay Johnson or someone else in the program, how is Jared Jones better this season, at least theoretically, than he was last season?
It's patience at the plate. It's just getting just again, I'm sounding like a broken record here, but a lot of it's just, again, patience at the plate, taking walks when he can, and just looking for something in the middle of the plate or in the outer half that he can drive. And he did that last night, where he sort of talked about how he knew the wind was blowing out into right field. So if he had something that he could sort of drive on the outer half, he would take it. And that turned into two opposite field home runs, right? So I guess just little stuff like that. And then I also asked him about this last night, because we got to talk with him. And that in Texas last weekend, he had like 4 or 5 doubles that were the same exact double. It was a line shot into the left center gap, and I think every ball was hit at least 112 miles an hour or something. Like, these balls were scorched. They just weren't getting elevated enough to the point where they were home runs. And he did it in like 3 different games too. It's not like he did this all in the same game. Um, and he just said it just, like, that sort of hit is when he knows he's hitting the ball in the sweet spot, and it's just sort of and I'm really paraphrasing here, but the sweet spot of his swing, when he's seeing the ball well, like, the ball's going to kind of come off his bat like that. And if you think about like the home run he had against Tennessee in the SC tournament championship game, it was a very, like, the ball was hit in the same like general vicinity. Is that was just launched higher, and it went 470 feet. So, like, when Jared's really going well and he's really driving the ball and seeing the ball well, like, and if the pitch is obviously anywhere near the inner half or just over the heart of the plate, the hit's gonna look something like that. I think that's just how his natural. I think that's how it works with his natural swing path.
Derek Curiel, the freshman, off to an outstanding start. I think we obviously knew he was good, right? But has there been any element of how surprising how good he's been right away? I compared it to this before you were on the beat, Koki, but I know you're familiar with it. I compared it to like Dylan Cruz, when as soon as he arrived at LSU, he was immediately like the best player on the field. And then he was the best player on the field, except maybe when Paul Skeens, on the days he was pitching, he was the best player on the field until his LSU career ended. Like, I'm not putting that on Curiel necessarily, but it's reminiscent of that for me of, oh, wow, this guy's already awesome. Has that been a surprise at all? Or is this kind of like, hey, yeah, we knew this guy was awesome, that's why we brought him here?
Um, Kind of. I mean, yes and no. That's how I'd answer that, because I think there were high expectations for him coming in, and I think people were very excited from what they saw in the fall and in the preseason. And it looked like he had earned a starting spot on this team, and that's a lot for a freshman already. But I don't know if everyone necessarily expected him to be, one of their 3 best hitters probably so far this season. I mean, in Texas, he got on base in 16 of 24 at bats, which is just plate appearances, excuse me. So 16 of 24 plate appearances he got on base, which is just absurd. And he's really sort of cemented that leadoff spot in the top of the order as kind of the perfect table setter for them, because he gets on base. He's obviously incredibly patient. His feel for the strike zone and just feel for the game and just natural ability and feel for the game is, you can't really teach it, A. And B, it's at a level that's kind of cruising, like, as you said. Like, that's the thing that, where he's taken, 0-1 pitches that are right in the black, where everyone else would, try to swing that pitch or, top it off or hit it weakly. He just takes it confidently, and his feel and awareness and it's just ability to pick up pitches as they're in flight. It's incredible. And yeah, and just the way he's able to stay within his approach, and I don't know, his eye for the ball, eye for the plate. So, um, yeah, he's on another level when it comes to these freshmen. And I don't know if he's going to win freshman of the year because there's a lot of competition for that apparently. But he is. Yeah, I'd be surprised if they moved him off the leadoff spot anytime soon, especially if he keep if he's anywhere playing anywhere near this level moving forward.
Yeah, he's gonna be a lot of fun to watch. You're right. There's some competition. Really good group of freshmen in the league. I guess that's no surprise. Speaking of Tennessee, they've got a couple of them. Levi Clark, I think, is chief among them. But Curiel is going to be right in that mix throughout the entire season. One last thing on the offense before we move to the pitching side of things. Jay Johnson raves about Josh Pearson, and I think it speaks to the depth of this lineup that, he's probably, if you made a list of the most dynamic offensive players for LSU, he's not very high up on that list necessarily. And yet he's a guy who we see can carry a lineup if he needs to. What does Jay Johnson love about him? I've heard, him raving about him. So what specifically does he like about having Josh Pearson in the lineup?
He likes that he's a veteran. He likes that he comes up in big moments time and time again. And he even references the fact that, his numbers haven't been the greatest. And sometimes it drives LSU fans up on the wall, and sometimes it confuses me. As like last year where he's hitting 240, but he's batting fourth on that team. But then there'd be some big moment in the eighth or ninth inning where they need a hit and he'd get the hit. It's just like it's like Groundhog Day with him in these big moments. He just keeps on coming through, and like this Frisco tournament was the perfect example where he's not even starting the game, and he comes in as a pinch hitter late in the game, ends up going into left field at one point, and he cuts off a ball, makes a perfect throw to Steven Milam, and Milam then throws out the runner at the plate to send the game into extra innings. And then in the 10th inning, he comes up and hits the go-ahead single in what eventually turned into an 8-5 win against Kansas State. So like that's like the perfect example. And then the very next day, he starts the game off 4 for 4 with 3 doubles. So yeah, he was just absolutely red hot in Frisco, and it was just kind of like the perfect example of like what this guy can do for this team. And as I mentioned, like he didn't even start that game because they're just because they just have so many options, especially in that outfield. And now they have a bit of a platoon at third base too. But I think that's the other thing with this offense. I feel like I should definitely mention is that they just got a lot more depth and versatility this year. They can really match up against lefties, against righties. Like Ethan Fry, he's a guy that not a lot of. If you're not an LSU fan, you probably don't know who he is. But he's the guy who's probably going to hit fourth or fifth and start at DH if a left-handed pitcher is in the game. But Jay Johnson isn't afraid to take him out in the 6th inning for a righty if the matchup calls for it. And this includes someone like John Pearson, who is the younger brother of Josh Pearson, who has now kind of crafted a role also as sort of a guy who can be a pinch hitter against lefties in that sort of scenario. Because John, unlike Josh, he's a right-handed hitter, so they sort of like his right-handed swing. So something about the Pearsons and their swings, it's really pretty to watch, honestly. But yeah, like they just have a lot more depth and versatility, and you sort of see that with someone like Josh, who isn't even starting in the Kansas State game, and then he started every game since then, actually, because he was so good in Frisco. But someone who didn't even start in that first game, but has just willed his way onto the field basically. And like someone like Ashton Larson hasn't started in the last 4 or 5 games, and this guy hit like 300 last year as a freshman. So just kind of gives you an idea of just like how deep and versatile this lineup is. And last thing I mentioned about the offense, like third base, they have this platoon with Michael Braswell as a righty, and Tanner Reeves is the lefty. Braswell's probably better defensively. Reeves has been better at the plate. And that's kind of something that's going to be interesting to watch for this team as well. But I've already pointed out a whole bunch of different positions now where they can just take guys in and out depending on the matchups. And they just didn't really have that line of versatility last year.
Yeah, it's a good point. I'm glad you mentioned the third base platoon because I think it's illustrative of the depth this team has, that Michael Braswell was such a big part of last year's team. And I'll point the finger at myself, so far exceeded my expectations about what he was going to be. And now it's like, I don't want to say an extra piece because that feels derisive, but just like he is part of a group of players who are involved at that position and on the infield, not like, hey, he's going to play at shortstop 56 games this season. Like it felt like at least last season. So just one more example of that depth. So let's talk pitching, Koki. No disrespect to Kate Anderson and Anthony Ianson, who have been excellent. The starter that interests me the most for LSU is Chase Shores, just given the history. And as important as the results is really for Shores, is just how does he look? How does he feel given that? So tell me, how has he looked? The numbers are good, but how has he looked? How does he feel? What have they seen so far from him?
Yeah, in terms of the way he looks and feels, I think everything is sort of on track there where he's 100% healthy now coming off that Tommy John surgery. The stuff is more or less back. He hasn't really I haven't seen him hit 100 since he's come back, but he's been up to 98, 99 at times, so it's still there in his pocket when he wants to, and he's still sitting, mid to upper 90s. He's It seems like he's kind of improved his slider since the last time that we saw him, and he still has a pretty good changeup. So all the pitches are more or less there. It's more of just like finding that consistency with locating everything. And the command, I don't think was great in his last start against Sam Houston, which I think was part of the reason why he gave up 4 runs in that game. But the stuff was still there, and I mean, I talked to a scout about it, just being like, "Hey, how did Sam Houston State, put up all these hits and got 4 runs off of him?" And part of that was the command, but it wasn't because of the stuff. And I think that's sort of a good sign for LSU fans, where he's still got a couple more starts before they really get into the teeth of SEC play, and you really want to see him sort of look like his old self from a results standpoint, by the time you're facing Texas and Oklahoma and some of these teams that are playing really well right now. So, yeah, I mean, when Chase Shores, I'll say this with the rotation really in general, and this is about Shores and the fact that like Chase Shores at his best is how this team is going to be at its best on the mound, because he's the most talented pitcher that they have. He is talented enough to where, Jay Johnson likened him to, if the football team had lost Garrett Nussmeier, the LSU quarterback this past season, it was like, not having Shores last year for the rotation. And I don't know if it's that big, because the quarterback position is the most important position in sports. But given LSU struggles in game threes last year, they definitely could have used him. So I think just his talent and the stuff that his stuff, like I feel like that, him at his best is how they're going to get the best version of this pitching staff overall.
Case and Evans, William Schmidt, both freshmen who have been extremely impressive so far. A similar question to that of when I asked about Curiel, like what has allowed them to be so successful this early on, and it kind of seems to me like those are two guys the coaching staff is going to trust to throw leverage innings against good teams once we get into SEC play.
Yeah, I have a story about Kaysen coming up that's coming out, I guess tomorrow, and
Nice.
he actually originally arrived at LSU as a two-way player, and but I think he kind of knew heading into it, and Jay knew heading into it, where that like his future was probably going to be on the mound. Kaysen just sort of decided that I'm just going to be a pitcher. And he just thought that, if I'm gonna be good at pitching, I need to put all my resources into that. And that's what he's done. And because of that, there was a velocity bump. He was up to 98 at opening day. I saw him at 99 in the fall, but he's really sitting more 94 to 96. He has a changeup that's so good it kind of looks like more of a splitter. And it's just got this really, really hard tumbling action. And then he's added a slider since he's arrived at campus, and he's talked about just sort of some of the keys. I'm not going to spoil the whole story, but he talked about some of the keys to sort of honing in that slider. So yeah, he's just been fantastic, and he also has all the mental makeup you need to sort of have that late inning role. And he got a little bit lucky in his Kansas State appearance in the first inning. He pitched against DBU with some batted ball luck and some good defense. But obviously the stuff is still there. He's still one of their best relievers. And whenever they get Gavin Guidry back, they can really pair those two guys, maybe even Connor Ware out of the bullpen. And because if you're talking about LSU's bullpen, like the numbers look decent and they haven't pitched quite as well lately, but we still haven't seen the full version of this bullpen. So I'm still kind of waiting to see like what's it going to look like once we get into SEC play, once they start facing the Texases and the Oklahomas of the world, where they can really stack the pitching on weekends. So Cason's obviously going to be an absolutely massive part of that, and William Schmidt could be a big part of that as well. It's just a question of whether they're going to have him keep on starting midweek games because he started midweek games the last 2 weeks, or are they just going to move him to the bullpen in a longer role? They keep on lengthening him out. Like he threw 60 pitches in his last start through not his last start, his start last week. And then yesterday he started against North Dakota State and got all the way up to 74 pitches. The command is like it's there enough to the point where we're not worried about it long term. There's still like little stretches where he'll walk guys or he'll hit guys. I mean, part of the reason why that sort of happened last night was because like LSU had these long innings offensively and he was just sitting on the bench for 25, 30 minutes and it seemed like it kind of affected him. But he still had 7 strikeouts in four innings. So the stuff is absolutely there. I mean, I don't know how many listeners have actually watched him pitch yet, but like the fastball is in the mid 90s and that's a really good pitch, but the real pitch for him is that curveball. The curveball is just this absolute hammer. It's got to be one of the best curveballs. It's probably the best curveball on the team and one of the best curveballs maybe in the conference. Like it is a disgusting pitch, and that was the pitch that was probably going to have him. That was the pitch where everyone thought he was going to be a first round pick, and then he just decided to come to LSU anyway. So yeah, I mean, both those guys have been really, really good, and it's going to be interesting to see what roles they they're going to sort of settle into, because it looks like Evans is going to be more of a factor on weekends, and Schmidt's going to be more of in a starting sort of role. But that's going to be important once they get into the SC tournament and into regionals and super regionals and whatnot, because that you need as much pitching and length as possible when you get into those situations. They're definitely going to use them for that.
Yeah, a couple of things there. First of all, I appreciate you stopping yourself and saying I'm not going to spoil the whole story, because if you hadn't, I would have. Because listen, listeners, pay for good journalism. Pay for journalism. And so read Koki's story. Secondly, you mentioned Gavin Guidry there, and I'm glad you brought him up. Just real quick, like, what is the official word on Guidry? What are the expectations there?
So the official word is a mid-body injury, which sounds like
Could be anything.
Super vague. It is super vague, but he said it was an upper body. Jay Johnson said it was an upper body injury, and then he corrected himself, said it was a mid-body injury. So at least he was like trying to be a little bit more exact in those terms. But he was supposed to start a Wednesday game 2 weeks ago against Nicholls State, but then woke up. But then that game got canceled. Then he woke up on Thursday not feeling so good. It's not an arm injury. It's not throwing related at all, which is, I guess that's a good thing. But I think Jay expected him to be available this week, but it looks like that's getting pushed to next week. He claims it's because they're trying to be careful with him. Maybe that is true. Maybe that isn't. Maybe it's something more serious. We'll see. And you know Jay as well as I do. Like he doesn't like to get too into the weeds with the injury stuff,
right?
To say the least. So we'll see. But they need him. Like they really need him. I mean, right? Like their bullpen's deeper than it has been the last couple of years. I think it's safe to say that. But when you can add a guy like that into the mix and either have Connor Ware or William Schmidt into your full bullpen mix, you already have Casey Evans, you already have Connor Benj. Now you're sort of cooking with gas a little bit, where it's not the situation of last year where it's like maybe you have Christian Little and you have Griffin Herring, and that's kind of it. Now they at least potentially have more options, and we haven't even mentioned like Maverick Rizzi or Cooper Williams, who are two other freshmen who have had some good moments as well. So I think this team's just way deeper on both sides of the ball, and you can really see that out of the bullpen as well.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you a question about, is there somebody out there that just either hasn't gotten a lot of run, or B, whose numbers don't necessarily tell the story? Like I think of Connor Ware, the ERA is 6, but every other peripheral number suggests that he's been way better than that.
So yeah,
go ahead.
I'll add some context on Ware's numbers. So he admitted, like, honestly, he just wasn't very good in this last start. Like he started on Tuesday against North Dakota State, and it was his defense didn't help him at all. Like there was like an easy pop fly in the first inning where like Kate Arambidi, the catcher, didn't communicate well with Jared Jones, and the ball just sort of fell in foul territory. And then there were just like massive groans in the crowd. And it kept the inning alive. It wasn't an error because no one touched it, but it was just ugly, ugly, ugly stuff. But he still like walked three guys and hit two others, or maybe those numbers are reversed. So it just wasn't a very good outing from him. But before that, he had gone through the first 7 innings of his season, which was a 3 inning start against Southern and a 4 inning start against Dallas Baptist, which is a real team, obviously, as Oklahoma learned this week. That's a real team. He threw 7 no-hit innings. Didn't give up his first hit until the 5th inning, where he gave up a leadoff homer, and then they took him out. So that's how kind of dominant he was. He has a really good IVB on his fastball, so he throws that thing up in the zone, pairs it with a good breaking ball, and now he's got sort of that two-plane thing going on there. So it's he's impressive, and I think they should definitely trust him, even though he had a really bad outing on Tuesday. So that sort of shocked me, but like, yeah, the ERA is now at 6, but before that it was like dominant. He was dominantly good. Maybe he isn't at 7 innings of no hit ball good, but he definitely isn't, like 5 runs in 3 innings against North Dakota State bad. So he's a good pitcher for them, and I think he's going to play a role for this team for sure.
Yeah, I appreciate the context on Connor Ware, because the stats are weird where his opponent batting average is under 100. But the ERA is where it is. Like
context,
it's just, and he's like not really walking that many guys, so it's just kind of a weird thing. So I appreciate that. Looking forward to getting my first look at LSU, hopefully sooner rather than later, because as Koki has detailed here, really deep on both sides of the ball. Feels like a team you could see 3 times in a weekend series and still not see all of their guys, which says a lot about what they have on the field this season. So looking forward to seeing how things go for the Tigers as they head into SEC play. Koki, appreciate you joining us today. Read his stuff at The Advocate. As I said earlier, pay for journalism. Koki's doing a lot of good stuff at The Advocate on LSU baseball. You should definitely be reading his work if you are not. Thank you, sir, for joining us this afternoon.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on, man. This has been great.
That's going to do it for this edition of Highway to Hoover, a production of SEC Extra over at d1baseball.com. Thank you to Academy Sports and Outdoors for sponsoring this and every episode of Highway to Hoover. Thank you one more time to Koki Riley for joining me today. You can follow him on social media at Koki Riley. That's KOKIRILEY, Koki Riley on social media. And thank you, the listeners, for listening.